Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, where today we're going to talk about E-2 renewals. And to help me dive into this question and go through all these nuances, I've invited our colleague, Asmina Simonyan, to join me in this discussion. Asmina, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, Charles. Everybody, I'm doing well. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really excited about our today's topic and would love to discuss it with you.
Good, awesome. That's good. Asmina, for those who don't know, Asmina heads up our department for E2 visas. So if there's anybody who should be excited about E2s, I think it should be Asmina. So as you can see, she's ready to get going here. And so without further ado, let's start talking about these issues related to the E2 today that we wanted to talk about. And specifically, we're going to talk about issues regarding renewals of E2s. Now, if you've been following our channel, you know we have a lot of videos out there already. We even have our E2 series where we talk about specifically, we go through the whole E2 process, the initial filing, what do you need, proving the source of funds, all this other stuff. So we've got all that and more information in our YouTube channel. So you should all check that out when you have a chance. But today we're going to focus on the renewals because there's something unique about the renewals. And in order to go into that, the renewals, we decided to create this special episode where we're going to only talk about renewals. And so if this is relevant for you, you've already gotten your E2, but maybe you've had some problems with the business. You haven't hired many people. Maybe you've hired nobody. Maybe revenue's down. Maybe you changed your line of business. Maybe you moved your business to another state. We're going to talk about all these issues and how they could affect either negatively or positively your renewal process. So let's get started on that. So what are we going to talk about first? Let's first of all, Asmina, let's talk about maybe 3 very common renewal issues that come up and what to do about them. So this is a little bit of a blitz, kind of a preview, and then later we're going to go into more details. So 3 really common renewal issues that clients ask about. So I'll get started here. First one is if the company has flat performance, very limited growth, very limited revenue performance. Problem or not a problem for a renewal scenario?
It might be a problem because we know that business is kind of a risky enterprise, right? And sometimes it may not go the direction we want it to go and we anticipate it to perform. So sometimes when the time comes to renew, we are seeing maybe some trends that don't follow the initial financial projections.
Okay.
It might be a little problematic, but there are ways around. If your company is not growing very well, as fast as you wanted it to grow, and probably the performance is not that great, there are things that you can show instead in order to convince the officer that actually the company is non-marginal working and the business is operating.
Right. I think with any scenario like this, you're creating a story, you're creating a narrative for the officer. So, if there's some weak spots in your company's history or operations, we try to brush over them and we try to focus on the positive, right? You downplay the negative, focus on the positive. And so I think they look at things in totality, right? They don't just look at just the revenue, just the profitability, stuff like that. So they're going to look at things in their entirety.
Yes, absolutely. If there is a growing trend, regardless of the actual performance, and if the figures are not that great, still there is a good chance for successful renewal because the trend from the beginning is growing. If you can show certain contracts or invoices confirming that the business is operating, that can fix the problem.
Right. So I would say maybe to then summarize this thing, of course, having good revenue and showing more active dynamic growth, that's always a better thing. But let's say you don't have that. It's not the end of the world. They look at a totality of factors, right? They're going to look at the general revenue trend. They're going to look at maybe general average ticket size. What are your average invoices? Are we gradually going up or are they gradually going down? They're going to look at marketing activity and other operational activities. And so here's an example too. We've had clients where, the first couple of years were tough. They were just tougher than they anticipated. Maybe there was COVID, there were other factors. But if we can show more recently, so let's say a client's going in after 2 years, they had a short, they weren't Canadian with a 5-year visa. Let's say they only had a 2-year visa. And let's say the first year and a half was really tough. But if we can show in that last 6 months or so, things were, we can point to highlights to show a turnaround. Hey, we just signed this very large client. We haven't received the money yet, but we just signed them and they're a very substantial, large client. Or we just signed this new partnership agreement and we're anticipating a huge increase in revenue based on this partnership. Things haven't quite taken off, but we're taking the first steps for that. Again, it's all part of the narrative that we put together. And I think that's something that's important when we're working with the clients to think about, okay, what can we, what's the positive spin we can put on this? How can we emphasize the good things that have been going well? Maybe not put too much attention on the bad things, and work with that to get the renewal.
So if we jump to the next point, then I would probably like to emphasize lack of hires, right? Sometimes, especially for startups, it's not that common to hire personnel from day one. Sometimes owners can take on certain positions and run that business for the first maybe year, even longer. And when the time comes to renew and there are no hires, neither W-2 nor 1099, is it going to be a red flag for renewal? Is it going to be a real issue?
Well, so yes, hires are important. Ostensibly, you're creating this business in the U.S. in part to create U.S. jobs, and so that's in part part of the objective of an E-2 visa. However, unlike say the EB-5, where the EB-5 specifically stipulates you've got to hire 10 people within 2.5 years, you don't have that explicit requirement with the E-2. So that does give you a lot of flexibility. Of course, having some employees is always better than no employees, but I'll be completely honest, we've had numerous clients who've had no employees whatsoever, and they got renewals. Now, I'm not encouraging that. I'm not saying don't worry about hiring employees. It's not a necessary, requirement. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if you have a really strong case and you're have very strong evidence on, the revenue side and the profitability and the growth side, it's quite doable to get a renewal without employees. But let's say you're not in that extreme scenario. Let's say even if you have, only one employee or two, or you just have a couple part-timers, or you have a couple 1099 independent contractors. I don't think generally, and Asmina, you can give your input as well. The government looks at that, but I wouldn't say that's a trigger point or a critical issue that if you don't reach a certain level, like in the EB-5, again, EB-5 is very explicit. If you don't reach that level, forget it. It's game over. We don't have that situation with E-2, so there is much more flexibility. So more employees is better than less employees, but I think we have flexibility.
Yeah, luckily that's true. Basically, there is no set requirements, as you said, Charles, for a certain number of employees for renewal. At the same time, someone may think that, okay, there is no law asking me to hire personnel. I can probably do it myself, right? But here is a tricky part, I guess, because what we tell our clients and the story behind it is basically that through your hires, you not only show the business performance and fulfill certain requirements, but you are supporting your position as an investor who is developing and directing the enterprise. And having hires is part of the process. And it actually puts you above the workers. You're an executive and you need certain stuff to manage to fulfill your position, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a very important point, Asmina. Right. And so to reiterate that, as an E-2 investor, your job is to guide and manage and direct the company. And if the company just consists of you, yourself, and maybe your spouse, there's not a whole lot of guidance and management that you're doing because it's just, a one-man show. So I certainly agree there that if there is a weakness of not having many employees, that weakness would be that you're really not managing anything because it's just, you yourself and, your truck, for example. So that's where I do agree. Yes, definitely that could be a weakness if you don't have many hires. The third renewal problem we wanted to highlight here in the initial few minutes of the podcast is, what about changing the line of business or even changing the location of the business? Asmina, how does that play out with renewals?
Yeah, that's a very good question because sometimes really the initial line of business may not go that well, and the applicant may think about changing the line of business and forgetting about the initial setup. In this situation, I guess it really might be a red flag because the business plan and all the initial setup was built based on the model initially provided. And if this model did not perform well and the operations on that model were shut down completely because the client has started a brand new, completely new line of business, it may trigger the need to amend the petition, right? There was no amendment, then apparently it might be tricky when it comes to the renewal.
Right. So we'll talk about maybe this a little bit more detail later in the podcast. But I agree with you that if you change your line of business and change your location, that can be a red flag. So I know we gave kind of a vague answer because it depends on a lot of factors. But maybe if we try to summarize it all, I would say the following: that if you're adding to the original line of business that you described in your business plan and when you went through the interview, if you're adding to that, you're not getting rid of that first line of business, then there's really no big problem, right? You're saying, hey, we had a donut shop to start with, but now we decided to, in addition, we started a consulting company. Okay, sure. I mean, you still have the donut shop, but you decided to do this as well. That's not really an issue. The issues can come up when you abandon completely that first line of business that you had, and you're completely starting over with a totally new line of business, maybe new equipment, and even more importantly, maybe a new location. And where that location is also can affect things. I think the general rule that we adhere to is if the new location is within the same city, it's probably not a big deal, right? The government's not going to care too much.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
I
But
picked up. Oh,
good.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. Yeah. What do you think about doing that smart move? And if, for example, the client has a couple lines of business in mind, but that client is not launching both lines of businesses at the same time, it might make sense to put the second one into the business plan for the second or third years of operation. So if something goes wrong, there are two lines of business. Even if something goes bad with the
Mhm.
first one and you continue with the second one, you'll have good chances for renewal without changing completely the.
Yeah. That's a good point too. Yes. That if you think there's a possibility in a couple of years down the road, you might add on or launch this new business line. Yeah, it's always good to maybe put that in the business plan because then later, if there's questions, you can say, "Hey, yeah, we discussed this originally." Now that brings up an interesting point that I wanted to mention though too. People ask about this a lot in the renewal setting. Is well, what if either the line of business, the performance, the number of employees significantly differs from what we had in the business plan? Is that going to create a problem? I'll have to say, in doing this almost 20 years, I've never seen a problem with that. I've never heard, and I don't think you have either, Asmina, I've never heard an officer pulling up the old business plan, kind of reading it through and saying, hey, wait a second here. You thought you're going to hire 5 people and you've only hired 1, or you were planning to get, $2 million in revenue and you're only at 1.1. I really, it's okay if there's digressions from the business plan because that's usually something that never comes up, right? They're usually going to look at you. Okay, as of today, what are you doing? What's your business line? How's the performance going? They don't compare it back with the business plan. And that's maybe a point I just wanted to mention as well.
Yeah. Fortunately, we haven't seen the officer going back and reviewing the business plan
Yeah,
and questioning why the
that's good.
performance wasn't as initially, yeah.
Right.
Uh, but
So let's dive now into the process of the renewal. And so we're going to talk about generally what's required for a renewal, but please keep in mind that it can vary on a number of factors. It can vary based on the type of business that you have, what documents exactly you need, where your where the embassy is that you're going to be attending the interview if you're going to be renewing it overseas. Um, because each embassy handles renewals a little bit differently. So the information we're going to give today is kind of like a generalization, and where relevant, we might point out and say, hey, Canada's a little different in this regard, or some other countries are different. But we're going to give you a generalized overview, but understand that in your particular case and in your particular country of origin, there might be some differences. So let's talk about how one goes about the renewal, and maybe more importantly, what documents and evidence we have to provide. So, Asmina, why don't you maybe mention here what are some of the basic documents that are relevant in most renewal cases that we have to do?
Yeah, sure. So basically, during renewals, the officer would definitely focus on the business performance. They don't care much about the investment because investment matters when you apply for your initial E-2, the source and passive funds. When we talk about renewals, we focus on the actual performance of the business because our primary goal is to prove that the business is non-marginal. So here we are going to be collecting as many documents as possible to confirm that, starting from maintaining business location, providing lease agreement, some photos of the premises, and continuing through the tax returns, all the necessary annual reports that must be placed if employees are working for the company, then certain documentation filed with the tax authorities at the end of each year, payroll summary, any contracts, invoices, all you have, maybe sales reports, all you have to prove that the business is real operating non-marginal enterprise and it does earn more than just to support the family of the main applicant. And the company can actually grow and make some profit out of the activity.
So I know this is a broad generalization, Asmina, but what clients ask us a lot, they say, okay, what's the bottom line revenue number I have to show? Like what's the minimum amount of, net income, for example, I need to show?
It's not somehow regulated by law, and there is no, I believe, bottom line saying that if you get somewhere below 10K, you won't get a renewal, right? So we've seen cases where it's doable even with a little income, net profit at this point. I believe there are like combination of different factors. If the revenue is pretty high, meaning that there are ongoing operations, right? But the net profits for certain reasons is not that high yet, but there is some employees or independent contractors getting paid. It's not that important how much of a net income you can really show, but definitely showing loss is probably
Not
will
desirable.
automatic. Yeah, that's what we're trying to
But
do.
I think we've even had renewals where they had a small operating loss, for example.
We did, right. If it can be explained, basically, in some businesses, for example, you can have loss. It doesn't mean that the company is not profitable, right? It means that it will be covered maybe within the next quarter or something. But I believe maybe it's not the only factor they'll look at, and if it really depends.
Right. So if we break it down again and kind of summarize what you, Asmina, just said, I would say that there's probably like three primary blocks that they look at. They look at operations, they look at the financial activity, and they look at, staffing and payroll. So, and as you mentioned, Asmina, operations, right? We're going to show, evidence of, real active operations, maybe showing some marketing assets, showing sample contracts, showing certainly, maybe insurance, permits, other stuff to show that it's really an ongoing. And in addition to that, so that would be the block for operations. Then we would have documents about financial proof. And so that would be, all the tax returns since you originally got your visa, showing your profit and loss statements and balance sheets. And then maybe kind of a snapshot or an overview of financial activity. And if, for example, the financial activity for the most recent time frame isn't that great, because who knows, maybe there's a recession. Maybe you guys just had a dip in, clients. Let's say, you have a seasonal business and, it was exceptionally cold the last 6 months in your market area and things were down. Any kind of narrative that we could provide to kind of explain things, as you mentioned, Asmina, that, kind of explains why there was a downturn, whatever, and why that's only temporary, we would add that as well. And then finally, in terms of the payroll and staffing block, right, we provide any kind of payroll reports or W-2s or 1099s that you might have. We might attach an org chart showing, the org chart at the beginning of operations and the org chart now as well, to show the growth as well. And again, like we talked about, If you didn't hire as many people as you had planned, that's not the end of the world. If you've hired nobody to begin with, also not the end of the world. Again, if we can come up with a good explanation, and if we can show compensating factors that, okay, maybe you have no employees, but your revenue is going great. You're getting 2 million in revenue and stuff like that. Again, that can compensate for a low level of employment as well.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I would like to add here, probably, Charles, that owner's role is also something that we usually try to emphasize during renewals. Basically, by any type of E2 support letter from the company outlining what exactly was done by the owner, how it led to these great results or the company's growth, and what's the future plans, basically. And we can put here the hiring plan as well for the next 5 years. We can put any financial projections that are in mind, but they haven't been in place yet, but the owner and the team is working to achieve those goals. So because the business plan is not required for renewals, we are trying to put together a little story and financial projections for the next periods in the form of a letter.
Right. Maybe while we're talking about some of these specific details about a renewal, let's maybe talk about for a moment the logistics. And what am I referring to? So, first of all, there's 2 ways, as you probably know, of getting an E-2. You can go to the embassy and get the visa there, and when you do that, your company is what they say becomes registered at that embassy. So at that embassy, in the E-2 department, they say, okay, here's company XYZ that's owned by this investor, and they came here 2 years ago, got their E-2 visa. The other way of getting an E-2 is by just doing a change of status in the U.S. So that's when you enter the U.S., say on a tourist visa, you change your status. You don't go to an embassy. You don't receive a visa because you're just changing your status within the U.S. And there's pros and cons of each approach, which way you'd like to go ahead and do this. But we should keep in mind, and Asmina, maybe you could touch on this, is if you changed your status in the U.S. and now you're going to the embassy to renew it, you're going to have a little bit more of the process is going to be probably a little bit more detailed and longer, and maybe not as expedited as if you had originally gone to the embassy, registered your company, and gotten your visa there. Because when you register with that embassy, any subsequent renewals and stuff like that are a little bit more streamlined, as opposed to if you change your status in the U.S., the embassy, say in Canada or the U.K. or whatever, they have no idea who you are, right? Because everything you did was here within the U.S. So maybe, Asmina, you can mention how does that affect the timing and the logistics when people are doing the renewal at the consulate?
Yeah, it's a very important topic, Charles. So basically, when it comes to renewal, you're absolutely right. And you already mentioned that if the company was already registered at any embassy outside of the United States, then the process should be streamlined because they won't need to look at the documents about the company information, ownership, and everything that was submitted initially. All they care about is the actual non-marginality of the business or financial performance of the business. But in case you initially change your status in the United States, or they will treat at the embassy, and at some point you decide that you need to renew or get your visa rather than just renew your status in the United States, they will treat your application as a new application at this point, because for an E2 it works a little different than for any other type of visa. When you get approval from the USCIS, for example, and just schedule an appointment to get your visa stamped, the Department of State and the officers at the consulate, they do have full power to review these applications. And if you intend to get your visa, you'll go through the consular processing, and they will review your application and make their determination, I would say, regardless of your previous status in the United States, probably in most cases.
Do you think, Asmina, I'm asking this question, I myself don't know the answer, I've got to think it through. If you did your change of status in the U.S., you never went to the embassy, now you're renewing it, but you're renewing it at the embassy. And so this is the first time they ever see your petition and stuff like that. To what extent do we really need to provide all the documentation about source of funds? Because is it possible they might request the applicant to provide information about the source of funds because they haven't seen this information before?
I'm almost sure that we have to, Charles, because even we see situations among different embassies, for example. We had a situation and a client asked us, what if the initial investor, he was an E-2 employee, what if the initial investor got his visa, the company is registered with the embassy in London, for example, and I'm a current resident of the Netherlands. Can I just go there because the process seems to be more straightforward, or they do have slots available right now, right? We reached out to the embassy directly, and the Netherlands told us, unfortunately, since the company is registered, even though the company has a valid registration right now with the embassy in London, they can't accept just a renewal or E-2 employee application. They do need the entire application from the very beginning. And at this point, I believe that in most cases, the embassy would start it from the scratch, and they would probably want to see the source of funds as well.
So that's a good point to mention then, and to reiterate for our viewers that if this is your first time going to the embassy because you did a change of status before, we probably will have to have a more more extensive renewal package that we prepare, kind of showing the initial investment as well, because this is the first time the embassy is going to see any of this, and it's quite likely they're going to say, well, show us how you invested the money and what you invested, etc.
Yeah, which shouldn't be a problem, because if the initial application was granted in the United States, then apparently the source and path of funds is clear and it exists. It's just a matter of providing this information to the embassy.
Sounds good. And again, each embassy is a little different. And for example, Asmina and I were also talking about this earlier. Some countries, when you if you've already been registered at the embassy, so let's say you were registered at the consulate in Toronto for Canadian citizens, I believe you can send in your passport for the renewal. You don't even have to go in for, an interview or physically be present. You can just send in your passports. Some embassies require you to be in the country if you were to do that mail-in service. I think we've done it before with Canada where the clients were actually in the US and they just mailed their passports from here. But I think maybe New Zealand, for example, requires the applicant to be in the country and then they can mail it into the embassy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. So it really depends, but it varies by the country. But in some situations, I believe general rule is that if your initial E-2 visa expired less than 48 months ago, you can renew, and there might be an option for an interview waiver. But it's just a case by case basis. It needs to be discussed. And
sounds good. Well, so I think that's been a lot of information so far, and then now we're going to try to turn the discussion into a more, I don't want to say practical. I don't think we've been discussing too much theory, but let's talk about some scenarios that come up a lot of times. And we'll kind of do a little bit of role playing or analysis of real life potential case scenarios. And I'm sure some of these scenarios apply to some of our viewers who have had an E-2 and are experiencing some issues and might have some questions. And so we'll kind of go through, maybe 3 or 4 scenarios of potential, of hypothetical situations and discuss how problematic, how difficult it might be for renewal and what needs to be maybe changed in order to ensure an approval. So let's get started here. With the first scenario. Asmina, how would you see it? Let's say the client comes to us and said, look, hey, we had a really slow first year. Performance on all fronts was below what we expected. But our business is real. It's real. It is developing, but it's just going at a much slower tempo. Can we get this renewed or not?
It's again, we have to review the entire story and see everything that is going on. If regardless of the low revenue, for example, the company has certain contracts, maybe independent contractors working for the company intends to hire more, and maybe, like you previously mentioned, the company is about to already signed a large contract, and they anticipate to start the project anytime soon and get some extra income coming into the company, then I believe the chances are pretty good. Again, it's about building a story and narrative and telling why the performance wasn't that great. But the good thing is that in most cases, the renewal won't happen until the expiration of the status or visa. Some visas can be issued for as little as 3 months period. We know that, but at least status is for 2 years. So probably if you were slow during the first year, but the second year you're getting better, it's already fine. It's good.
Right. Absolutely. And so we can grade, we'll grade each of these scenarios on a green, yellow, red scale. So I would say this kind of situation would be a yellow situation, but very resolvable, very easily to convert it over to the green side. So I think this would likely be renewable. So let's go to a next scenario. Revenue is fine. We're getting good revenue, maybe even hired employees, but we're not profitable on paper. How much of a problem is this? And maybe I can respond to this one. I would say, again, profitability is not a requirement per se. Of course, you need to show that the business is non-marginal, and that the business is able to develop and grow, and it's not just covering the financial needs of the owner, that it's developing and it's growing and earning enough revenue to support the business itself and support its further growth. So obviously, if you don't have any kind of profits, that's a hindrance to that. But this gets back to maybe partially what Asmina referred to in the previous example. As long as we can create a strong narrative and explain why the company is not making a profit, but why it is likely to do so in the near future, then I don't think you'll have much of a problem, or you shouldn't. I think if we can give reasons why, financially things are going to turn around. And again, it also depends on what time frame we're talking about. If this has been going on for the last 5 years and it's been unprofitable, I'll agree. That's a little bit more of a problematic situation than if, let's say, a person only had a 1-year visa or a 2-year visa, and we're already renewing after 1 or 2 years. That's a much shorter time frame. And I think officers will tend to be a little bit more flexible in that situation, such that they understand, okay, first year almost inevitably is a difficult year for startups, right? And okay, maybe year 2 is a little bit more difficult. But again, if we can point to positive aspects or positive points of growth that will, help propel the company going forward, I think we should be good in that regard. So I would rank this as a yellow, but likely, to be a green. Ultimately.
Green. Yeah.
How about the following scenario, Asmina? Let's say somebody bought an existing business, which I think overall the majority of our clients tend to open their own business, but we do have clients who buy existing businesses. Let's say they bought an existing business that on paper was doing very well, had good revenue, met all the criteria, but revenue dropped significantly after the acquisition. How do you see that playing out?
Well, definitely that's not a good sign, probably. But at the same time, if it can be explained, if it's not that the owner just didn't do anything and the business was bought primarily for the purpose of getting a visa and the operations were shut down, and it can be seen by the bank statements or lack of employees, for example, that might be a red flag. But at the same time, if it dropped naturally because of certain events, or maybe they were trying to change the business approach somehow, or so that the business can perform even better in the future, and it was a little drop that will be definitely followed by a cross or some really good jump in the future. If it can be explained, I guess it's
should be doable. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, should be. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that kind of falls in the same category of kind of a yellow, but certainly we can make it a green, as long as we could put together a good narrative.
Right.
Let's wait for a final scenario. This is probably going to be the most difficult one and the most interesting one to discuss. But this can come up a lot of times. What if a client comes to us, they got their visa, we didn't hear from them for, let's say, 4 or 5 years, 4.5 years, they come to us finally in 4 years and say, Charles, we want to renew our E-2. And we say, hey, great, we'd love to help you guys. And they say, well, there's something we have to tell you. We actually sold the business a couple years ago, and then we moved out of state. and then we started up a new business. Can we renew in that scenario?
Most likely not, but let's break it down, right?
Right, exactly. It depends on the details. And so here's something. Yes, that's it. Let's break it down. Like when people, the first thing I would say is when people say we sold the business, what does that mean exactly, right? Because people don't always think like attorneys or lawyers when they say these things. If you sell the business, it's one thing if, let's say we had a client, they had a cafe, and when they say they sold a business, did they just sell the assets of that cafe? They just sold, the client lists. They handed the lease over to the buyer. They sold whatever equipment they had, but they kept the legal entity. Or did they sell the legal entity itself? Right. So for me, that's the critical question we have to ask, because if they sold the legal entity, then our client is probably in hot water. This is a deep, deep red situation because the E-2 is issued and tied to a specific legal entity, right? You're investing in a company, a business, an LLC or a C Corp. And the E-2 is contingent on you being an owner of that C Corp. Once you sell that business, there's no grounds for you to keep your E-2. But if you just sold, the assets, the client lists, whatever, but you didn't sell the actual LLC or the C Corp, then we're on stronger ice. We're not out of the woods completely. And Asmina, maybe you can play on that. Let's say that there's a scenario here where the client, they kept the LLC, the business, the legal entity. They sold the cafe and the lease and whatever. They got rid of all that. How would that play out with a renewal? They still kept the company. And let's say they decided they sold it. They kept the company. They sold the cafe, but now they decided to develop, a financial consulting company within the auspices of this LLC that they have. How would that affect things?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Charles, good thing is that they didn't jeopardize their E-2 status by selling the entire business. So they were in the United States lawfully. They could remain in the United States. But since they're changing the business model completely, they may not be able to renew if they didn't keep the initial line of business, right? They got rid of it completely and they're just starting something brand new. Probably the best path for them would be to start all over again, because I assume if the assets were sold, apparently the funds they got from that sale, they were reinvested in the same business, right? And probably with that funding, they started a new line of business. And then they should go probably with a new source and passive funds, with a new business plan, because usually changing in certain things like maybe location sometimes, if you move too far from a place you initially register your business or your office was registered, or you're changing your line of business completely, and shutting down your initial line of business, it may trigger the necessity to file an amendment. And if it wasn't done within the initial petition, it might be problematic to do renewal, I believe.
Right.
What is-
Right. Yeah, it depends on a lot of factors. I agree. If they totally sold the business, they took that money that they got from selling it, they kept the legal entity itself, and then they started up another business with it. Yes, I think that would be, you'd probably have to kind of file a new petition. Now, what happens more often, I think it's relatively rare, if I'm not mistaken, for clients to completely sell the business that they have and then go into a new line of business completely separately. I think what happens most often in our practice is clients, they keep that initial line of business. Maybe they reduce it a little bit. So let's say maybe they had a trucking company. Let's say they had 2 trucks or 3 trucks. Maybe they reduced it to 2 trucks or 1 truck because it just wasn't so profitable. They still keep a little something going on, but they haven't completely gotten rid of the business, but they've reduced it. And then instead they decide to invest their money, the existing money they have or some new money, into another line of business. They want to start up a cafe or something. So I think we have more flexibility when the client doesn't completely abandon the first line of business. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so this is a word of advice to anybody out there, whether you're working with us or not, is, before you make these major changes in terms of sales, of line of businesses or, changing line of business, consult with your attorney, because, if you come to your attorney 2 years after the fact, there's not a whole lot that person can do to help you. But if you haven't done it yet, we can help structure things in a way so that when you go to do the renewal, it'll be easier for you, or we're going to avoid any, unnecessary questions or red flags that might come up from the embassy. And so what do I mean by that? For example, what we tell clients a lot of times, okay, if it's possible, let's just nominally keep that original line of business that you have. Okay, it's not bringing you much money, but at least it's still there. Because then, when you go to renew, you don't have to say, hey, we got rid of this whole business. It was unprofitable. We've completely changed. No, you can say, we still have this original business that we were doing. Granted, it's on a smaller scale, wasn't so profitable, but we decided to diversify and put more money into, this other line of business. And this is all within the framework of your existing LLC, but you're just going down a different path. So I think that gives our client more flexibility, and it makes the process of the renewal a little bit easier.
Yeah, in this case, we definitely have good chances for renewal. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as you can see, renewals for the most part are doable. Whether it's an initial E-2 application or an E-2 renewal, the general overall statistics are very favorable. Unless you have a very problematic situation, we are generally able to get, the vast majority of our clients, a renewal. But there are nuances and there are complications that can come up, and it really depends on a case-by-case basis. And you'd be amazed, the fact situations that sometimes come to us, just very strange configurations and situations that you could never imagine would happen. And then we have to kind of work through with the client to come up with the, ideal strategy going forward to, achieve their renewal, or if they're filing for an initial E-2. So hopefully this was helpful to you and all the viewers out there. And thanks again, Asmina, for your time to discuss these nuances of E-2. And if you're considering filing for an E-2, or you already have an E-2, but you maybe have some problematic aspects related to it, and you're looking to do the renewal in the near future, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to give you our insights and suggestions as to how to best structure everything in order for you to continue developing your business and continuing your life here in the U.S. So thanks again, Asmina, for your time.
Thank you very much, Charles, for your time, for inviting me. I hope I liked our today's discussion. I really hope it was useful for our listeners and viewers, and we were able to add clarity and somehow make it clear how the E-2 renewal process was.
Absolutely. Well, thanks once again. And again, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, consider subscribing to our channel. And hopefully you're listening to this podcast from one of the platforms we're on, and you will listen to subsequent ones that we have on the E-2 and other aspects of business immigration to the U.S. Once again, Charles Raether from AmLaw Group and Asmina Simonyan. Until we meet again in the near future. Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.